Good morning, Vietnam, and here I am back again. For my next video, this is going to be part 2 of my 4-part series on HIV/AIDS and how we have been sold a bunch of goods that has no logic, no real research, no proof that HIV even exists, and that especially that it causes AIDS. So the first part was the beginnings. The second is just simply more information of what transpired from the mid-80s up to about 2005. After the initial discovery of HIV by Montagnier. And I have added some notes in the beginning I want to go over, so it's going to hopefully not lengthen this video too much. I will add the important web pages that you can look up yourself in the description of this video, if you don't want to listen to me for the next 2 hours. So, here we go. I'm going to transfer over and show my notes on the screen and show you the difference from the original part 1 to part 2, and also discuss more of the original article on Montagnier and his discovery. So here we go. You can see on the screen it is the same as the first part, but this is the general AIDS story, what happened roughly between 1985, mid-80s all the way to the mid-2000s, because anything anything after that was just more of the same. Nothing has changed except things like gene splicing, gene therapy, and some other creative innovations that I will discuss in the next part. So you can see the second part, as I said, is going to be the AIDS story. Third part is drugs and treatment, with AZT especially, and discuss genes and another word they came up with, seroconversion. And finally, I'll discuss 2 articles, one written by the denialists and journalist and researcher CELIA, and she wrote another article in 2005, and then Dr. Gallo, one of the discoverers of HIV, took great exception and wrote a counter article to try and debunk her. And I discussed that in great length. And as I said, we'll always open up with Mahatma Gandhi's quote, "An error can never become true, however many times you repeat it. The truth can never be wrong, even if no one ever hears about it." So, as I said in the first part, one thing that always surprised me was how is it that when COVID-19 broke, that they spent a lot of time tracing people with it to try and control the spread of it. But absolutely none of this happened back in the early 80s, mid-80s, 90s, 2000s. It just never happened. So this is basically what I talked about in part 1, and death certificates, that there's no one really researching it and correlating any of it, why people die. And we'll get into this statement here. There were many test kit companies initially, but there's only one left, and why? So I'll get into that in the next one. So here's a statement I think I've added. The reasons are that they cannot prove definitively that HIV exists. They claim that, but there's still, in my opinion, no real photograph of the HIV virus. They've just shown you photographs of viruses they claim to be HIV. And also what you die of. But as I say here, COVID-19, herpes and viral bronchial infections have been with us forever and will continue to be. And hopefully this debacle, the HIV debacle, will cease, because we were all dying of these infections before HIV became the cause célèbre. Anyway, I go back into CD4 plus cell counts. And I say you can look at it any way you want. HIV is not a virus by any definition, and nobody with the expertise of viruses, well, there's so many of them that have said that simply HIV is not a virus. And Dr. Duisberg, who has been a denialist of this whole theory, does claim HIV exists, but it's just simply another one of those thousands of viruses we have in our body all the time, and it is harmless. I introduced the microbiologist Stefan Lanka in the previous one, and I discuss his article more later. Another thing, and that's why I've included it in this opening segment again, I'm talking about the opening segment again. I've included this list, and I came across them after I did the first one, and they are now what's called opportunistic infections. In other words, what they're saying is that because they can't prove so much of the lies about HIV and how you die, how HIV causes AIDS, and then you die. So what they've now said, as I just mentioned earlier, these are the diseases you acquire after you contract HIV. But again, as I just mentioned, we have had all these diseases for so many years before HIV was found. Why aren't more and more people dead? But they're not, because HIV doesn't exist, and we've had these diseases forever, and we'll continue to have them. But there's a great many articles now on opportunistic infections, because, again, they can't prove definitively anything about HIV. Now, I mentioned this in the first one at the end of it about South Africa, or Africa, or any third world country, that they were attributing all these deaths to HIV, but in fact there was absolutely zero tests. All you needed was 5 symptoms, physical symptoms: fever, malnutrition, weight loss, no appetite, and there was one more which I can't find. So again, these are all symptoms of poverty. And as I say in the bottom, because it is not about AIDS, it is all about poverty and nutrition. As President Mbeki said as early as 1989, and he refused to take the expensive drugs, especially AZT at that time. Now, I go back to the original article because on rereading it a few more times and doing more research on parts of it, I felt that I had to come back to it. Reference 16 is, as you see, the lymph node biopsy that they took from a patient. Well, they're saying now this is confusing. Was it one patient or more than one patient? Excuse me. Because it says would later become known as HIV in a lymph node biopsy. That means one biopsy. Is there one patient that only had this? so-called HIV in their lymph nodes. And again, it was originally called LAV, and it was published apparently in 20th of May 1983. Now the dates, as I say later, get quite confusing. Reference 16. This is the woman, Francois Bar-Sunusi, talking. We thought it could be a type of HTLV, the first human retrovirus, which was identified in 1977. So she claims they had to grow the virus, they had to keep it alive, they fed it white blood cells to keep it alive. It stayed alive for 3 weeks. And they were very lucky to have worked that out. I don't see why, but anyway, and in May 1983, so in a few months, they were able to go from Willie Rosenbaum asking them to look at a few patients to being able to definitively say that they have found this new virus and it causes immunity deficiency and then you die. As I write, they found the sample from one lymph node, only one location. So why wasn't it found anywhere else in these patients who were apparently immunodeficient? So, as I said in the first part, they're sick already. Who were these donors? Who were these patients? How can they reach such a definitive conclusion from one sample? Gallo claims he discovered retroviruses back in '79, but who knows? Not really that important. And this whole article, or this part of the article, I just don't know. I after reading, I don't know, more than 100 articles about the research of HIV and AIDS, I just don't know how much of it is actually even true. So here's an article by Gallo in 2005. And I've tried to read it. Some of the article gets too technical for me. And I don't even know why he's writing it. He's written a number of articles. I mean, if they discovered HIV back in 2003, why are there even articles? Well, after 2005, so many articles keep writing and trying to prove that HIV causes AIDS. I've said in the first one, I think that HIV and HTLV are the same thing. I haven't read anything that claims really definitively that they are in fact different. They are the same. Whatever they found, they are the same thing. And Gallo claims here, after an initial struggle to publish in the Journal of Virology, fortunately we were soon able to publish the original report in PNAS, and this opened the door. I don't know what door it opened, but it soon became clear that HTLV-1 was specifically associated with adult T cell malignancy, usually CD4 plus cells, in which the patients frequently had cutaneous abnormalities and hypercalcemia. And I write because the Journal of Virology requires peer review, and he couldn't wait for that, or couldn't trust it, so he published it in PNAS, which does not require a peer review. Now, cutaneous, pertaining to the skin, of course, possibly was Kaposi sarcoma, which is very common in gay men with immunodeficiency because they took large amounts of nitrates. And hypercalcemia a lot of cancers can cause hypercalcemia. Now, obviously, from the term, hypercalcemia refers to too much calcium in your system. Now, about 2% of all cancers are associated with hypercalcemia. And they often have a rapid onset and are severe. So, certain types of cancers that can cause hypercalcemia include lung cancer, breast cancer, multiple myeloma, cancers that form in a type of white blood cell, kidney cancer, leukemia, lymphoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, taking too much calcium carbonate in the forms of Tums or Rolaids is actually one of the more common temporary causes of hypercalcemia. So these patients were already really sick, immunodepressed. But what came first? Well, we don't know because they don't do enough research, they don't do enough testing. But they claim that the virus came first, and then you got these all these patients who are immunodepressed. But the thing is, they don't really know that. They're just making that assumption because especially from a guy like Gallo, who he'll only write anything that supports his thesis. And well, I won't get into the retrovirus. I've spoken to it already in part 1. I think I mentioned it a bit later. Now, continuing from the main article from Montagnier, it states that Gallo published similar findings in the same issue of Science. This is where it gets really confusing. I don't know whether he actually published it a year later or in the same issue, because it's mentioned in different articles on different dates. So, confirmed the discovery of the virus and presented evidence that it caused AIDS. Gallo called the virus HT lymphotropic virus type 3 because of the perceived similarities with HTLV1, which had previously been discovered in his lab. I talk about reference 18 below in a minute. Because of the timing of their discoveries, there were acrimonious disputes about who discovered it. Anyway, HIV isolates usually have a high degree of variability because the virus mutates rapidly. That's important in a second. In comparison, the first 2 human immunodeficiency virus type 1, HIV, formerly known as LAV, and then Li3b, formerly HTLV3b, isolated from a pooled culture at the Laboratory of Tumor Cell Biology at the National Cancer Institute, were strikingly similar in sequence, suggesting that the 2 isolates were in fact the same and likely from the same source. Firstly, if it mutates rapidly, how did they control it? How did they keep testing it if it kept mutating so quickly? 2, which I'll go into more detail in a second, about, as I said earlier, HIV and HTLV are in fact the same. They came from the same culture. So, this was an article published in 1991. And it talks about the, reference 20 from the original article. 2 of the first human immunodeficiency virus type 1 were collected, and as well as uncultured primary material, clone polymerase chain reaction products were used to analyze coding sequences, Here we go. The original isolate, HIV-BRU, formerly called LAV, that was the original culture taken from the lymph node. Now, after research, because there was such a lot of argument about who discovered HIV, HIV-1 LAI was derived from patient LAI. So now we have two samples. But the second sample, LAI, was contaminated with BRU. And this was sent to GALLO in August 1983. So how could GALLO then publish back in May of 83? This is where it gets a bit confusing. The culture became, in effect, LAI. The secondary, the original BRU contaminated with another patient's blood sample. Because of this contamination, two rather than one HIV-1 isolates were sent to the Laboratory of Tumour Cell Biology, in other words, the GALLO, on the 23rd of September. So the original sample by the original patient, Brew, was the original marker. However, the second one, Lie, now to try and cover up all this, whatever they're trying to say or separate, a strain capable of growing on established cell lines, whatever that means, the striking similarity between HIV-1 Lie and HTLV-3B sequences remains. In other words, they're saying that whether it's Brew or Lie, it is the same thing, and HTLV is also the same thing. So the culture they got from either Brew or Lie, in fact, is the same. So, what was the difference between the patients, Brew and Lie? Why were there two strains? What was the difference in the, as I say, in the patients? What? There's no mention of any of this. As I say, you try to confuse you and I. Yes, it's all it does in the end, the language they use and so forth. And the way they wrote this explanation between Brew and Lie, and then justified in some way with a strain capable of growing on established cell lines as being the difference. I mean, it's just... No wonder they can't get it peer-reviewed extensively anyway. Of course, there's pro-HIV people who will peer-review it and keep researching it forever and ever. So it goes on. The original article was published in Science in May 1993. Sorry, that's 83. Plus contaminated samples in August of 1983. How did they publish in May 1983? I'm talking about GALLO. So it looks like a mistake. It appears that GALLO published in May 94. So GALLO did not know and could not distinguish between them. I mean, if he was such an expert and already been doing this for well over 20 years, studying viruses, then how could he not know that there was two samples or two strains from two different patients? And I think because they are the same, HIV and HTLV the same, number one, and the samples they gave, even though the Lie sample was contaminated with the Brew sample, in fact, under a microscope, they were probably they were identical. And from the two samples, I still don't get why no one ever asked this. The only sample they've talked about so much is from this lymph node, and yet somehow HTLV came into it even from the French team. I'm sorry, it's too confusing for me. Continuing from the main article, they wanted to clear up the problem between the two groups, the French and the American groups, Montagnier and Gallo. So they asked the National Cancer Institute and the group led by American epidemiologist Shen-Yung Chang, as I mentioned in the first part, examined archival specimens, which we assumed were okay, and 2.5 years later, he concluded that the American sample in fact originated from the French lab. Well, I thought we knew that, or either Gallo had stolen it. The French lab gave it to him. This is where it gets really interesting. Chang determined that the French group's LAV was a virus from one patient that had contaminated a culture from another. On request, Montagnier's group had sent a sample of this culture to Gallo, not knowing it contained 2 viruses. It then contaminated the pooled culture in which Gallo was working. So, how it was supposed to be one virus. So what is Chang saying? What 2 viruses? Though it's supposed to be the same immunodeficiency virus, HIV. And how, as I just said, Gallo did not know there was 2 samples, 2 viruses. Chang claims there were 2 viruses. What 2 viruses? And why? So it had to be identical if Gallo couldn't tell the difference. I don't know. Lies built on lies. And why did they want to research it again to find out who discovered what? And because it came down to money. Who was going to get the most money from the test? And of course, Montagnier ended up getting more percentage of the money from the test because he was the initial discoverer, and even though apparently Gallo discovered it at the same time, but he got his cultures from Montagnier. So, history of HIV and AIDS. So I just want to go back a little bit on that discussion 2-3 minutes ago. With Chang's discovery that not only were there 2 samples sent, and not only that one sample was contaminated, and his statement, so I guess he did the test as well after to research it, that there were 2 viruses. I mean, why wasn't there at that time a complete rethinking, revamp, somebody looking at what the hell was going on with that, with those samples? But they're already so into it, into the lie 10 years later, that even Chang, he must have known the way he wrote that there's something really, really wrong with what's going on with HIV and the discovery of HIV. Anyway, it just boggles me that nothing happened after that fact and after he wrote the report, that nobody wanted to look into it. They just took everything at face value with all those mistakes. Anyway, back to the history of HIV and AIDS. So back to the history of HIV and AIDS. This is part of that Wikipedia page, which is a very, very long page, on the history of HIV and AIDS. Most of it is absolutely rubbish and absolutely unproven, even though they have a lot of footnotes. And there's two sentences here that I found very interesting. One is, it is not yet explained why only 4 HIV groups, etc., spread considerably in human populations, despite bushmeat practices being widespread in Central and West Africa, and the resulting human SIV infections being common. Well, first of all, you can't prove that, how many people were infected by eating bushmeat. And when they say bushmeat, they really are referring to monkeys. SIV is simian immunodeficiency virus, in other words, from monkeys. As I say there, it's never been proven anywhere. See part 1 of this series. The next sentence, it also remains unexplained why all epidemic HIV groups emerge in humans nearly simultaneously and only in the 20th century. Despite very old human exposure to SIV, so SIV has been around for tens of thousands of years. So why suddenly all this and sudden discovery that HIV exists? I mean, wouldn't the virus come from Africa much earlier than late 1970s, early 1980s? Why aren't there many, many, many more people dead? This is another Wikipedia article on Luc Montagnier, and this is reference 18. It was published in May 1984, so only a year after they published the original paper claiming that they found a new virus, HIV, and it is also full of loopholes, which I'll go through now. So detection, isolation, and continuous production of cytopathic retroviruses. In other words, the death or destruction of your blood cells. So, I've written, to what extent did AIDS exist at this time? Now, it's exactly a year since the first article was published, so there is not, how can it be possibly, and it's written, the idea that it was proven beyond a doubt already with so little research. At a minimum, where did these patients come from? Or with signs or symptoms that frequently precede AIDS? What were humans dying of before suddenly HIV came about? Now he makes a statement, or the article does, that cells are specific clones from a permissive human neoplastic T-cell line. They're referring to HTLV or HIV. So, an interesting statement. One cytopathic effect of HTLV3, HIV that is, in this system is the arrangement of multiple nuclei in a characteristic ring formation in giant cells of the infected T-cell population. These structures can be used as an indicator to detect HTLV3, again HIV, in clinical specimens. But where is the logic to that? So anywhere else that you might have a virus that does the circular characteristic ring formation suddenly is HIV. So no other virus does anything similar to that. This system opens the way. Again, it doesn't open anything. It's just something that they notice with their research. As I write, this is very hard to believe how they can reach all these conclusions based on so little data and research. I'm going to have to skip a lot of things that I've written. If you want to read all my notes, please go ahead. Otherwise, this video is going to be 3 hours. There's no need for me. I will cover what I think is essential that I want to impart onto you. Going back to Stefan Lanka, which I highly recommend you read his full article written in 1995. And he makes a reference to the research done by Montagnier and Sunusi, and his reference 18, this is him writing, they concluded, quoting from the article by Montagnier, the role of the virus in the etiology, that is, medical causes of AIDS, remains to be determined. And yet, they almost emphatically said that they have found a virus that causes AIDS. Now, these two articles, I've read parts of them, and I'm going to research it further for the next part of this series. And when Montagnier accepted his 2008 Nobel Prize for finding HIV, he said, HIV is the main cause, but could also be helped by accomplices. He was referring to other infections, perhaps from bacteria and a weakened immune system. But that's exactly correct. So why isn't there any more research done on these assumptions, reflections, to see if that in fact it's true? He cannot prove that HIV is the main cause. People have been dying of all these other causes for centuries, thousands of years, but suddenly it's all because of HIV. So, as I said, this is the main page on Wikipedia about denialism. It's quite long, has a lot of references, and it's part of my initial pages I refer to in the description if you don't want to hear me talk. But there's a couple of things I will mention. One is the Christine Maggio story, because when it was happening, it was in real time for me, and I remember the case very, very well. Basically, that how the HIV epidemic and the lies associated with it completely have destroyed, and I would estimate, thousands and thousands of people's lives, because they've insisted that HIV causes AIDS, and there's no other reason why people get very sick and are dying. So I highly recommend that you read her whole story, and the lies that were perpetrated, especially by the LA medical department, when they did the autopsy on her, they absolutely lied that her daughter was HIV positive. And they've completely lied that Christine Maggio also was HIV positive. And she wrote a book, and I bought a copy, and it's a pamphlet of about 100 pages, published in 2006. What if everything you thought you knew about AIDS was wrong? And I can assure you, if you can ever get a copy and read it, I highly, highly recommend it. You can buy it on Amazon, because it spells out the absolute lies from early 80s all the way to 2006 of how they have tried to convince people and lied through their teeth about HIV and about the tests, of course. So here is I've got a couple of reviews which I'll go over quickly. This person commented on around 3 years after Miss Maggiore and especially her daughter died. As she writes, they would have you believe that both the author and her daughter died of AIDS-related pneumonia. Here's what they won't tell you. And I'm going to read through these two reviews, and then I'll skip a lot more of my other notes. Since her death in 2005, Eliza Jane lung slides have been submitted as evidence in no fewer than 3 criminal court cases in Texas and California as an example of healthy lung tissue. These slides are available for review at, and I don't know where that is. I challenge anyone to look at these slides and find any sign of pneumonia. So how did EJ die of AIDS-related pneumonia if she didn't have pneumonia? Because that's what was listed on her death certificate. Number 2, in the last weeks of her life, Eliza Jane was examined by 3 different physicians, all of whom found her lungs to be clear. The last of these, Dr. Philip Incao, prescribed amoxicillin for an inner ear infection. Upon taking her first doses of amoxicillin, EJ immediately became ill, and within 48 hours of the first dose, she was dead. Number 3, the coroner who ruled Eliza Jane's death to be an AIDS death, Dr. James Shaken Baker, Shaken Baby, I guess it refers to something he has said before. Dr. James Ribbe has come under investigation for numerous counts of perjury, and several innocent parents wrongly convicted in their child's deaths have since been exonerated. Tragically, however, some remain behind bars. But the most important fact that Christine's critics will never tell you is this, and I can assure you this case, especially in LA, was huge. Christine Maggiore was HIV negative, and that's what I knew to be 100% true from day one. She first tested positive in 1992. A year later, she was retested about a dozen or so times and got multiple negative results, multiple indeterminate results, and multiple positive results. This is one of the things that first led her to question the validity of HIV tests. And this is so true of the test. And if you read any literature on the test even today, it says one test does not mean you are positive, even if it comes positive. You have to take a second test. So if you get a negative test, what happens then? As I mentioned in part 1. Now, the common wisdom among AIDS professionals is that in a patient who is truly infected with HIV, the test will only vacillate in the first 3 to 6 months after initial infection. But after 6 months, if the patient is truly infected, they will consistently test positive. Well, since Christine tested negative more than a year later after her initial positive test, and was living in that extreme low-risk group to begin with, if you remember the 4 H's, it is far more than likely that she was an example of what is known as a persistent false positive. I am far from the first person to point this out. In fact, her critics were saying exactly that just before they got the good news of her daughter's death. So they called her a liar through and through because of the autopsy report that her daughter died of AIDS. So this is the second review. So, sorry, this is still the first review. So Christine died of AIDS-related pneumonia, even though she didn't have HIV, and her daughter also died of AIDS-related pneumonia, except that she didn't have pneumonia of any sort, AIDS-related or otherwise. It seems to me that there were that if there were any actual scientific proof that Christine was wrong, these grave dancing gals would pony up that proof and allow Christine and her daughter to rest in peace. Let their behaviour, let their behaviour stand as proof that they have no other way to prove her wrong. And who am I to say these things? I happen to be someone whose life was spared as a direct result of the work of people like, Christine Maggiore. Before I read this book, I weighed 120 pounds in wet clothing. And I was struggling to even breathe. Today I weigh 200 pounds, buck naked, and I sing, albeit badly, in a hard rock band. If Christine's critics would use her and EJ's death as anecdotal evidence that Christine was wrong, then I am the living proof that she was right. So this is the second review. I've actually read the book and the positive and negative comments. I want to point out some facts. And she points out very, very similar facts to the first reviewer. The author's daughter did not die from pneumonia. One expert opinion is not always the right one. Even though Christine refused to do an autopsy on her daughter, and this reviewer also goes on to how the coroner was an absolute liar and a disgrace to the industry, and already being sued for negligence. So, about amoxicillin, the onset of an allergic reaction to amoxicillin can be very sudden and intense. Emergency medical attention must be sought as quickly as possible. And by the way, both her husband and son repeatedly test HIV negative. So I write, if it's not HIV, then what causes AIDS? The reviewer goes on, as absurd as this question sounds, if you do your own research, you'll find that many of the people who support the author are scientists, doctors, and Nobel laureates who were at the forefront in developing the HIV test. Rodney Richards worked on the development of antibody, one of the first antibody tests, what was called ELISA, and the genetic viral load test for Amgen, and holds some related patents. He states that the diagnosis of being HIV positive is based on arbitrary combinations of tests, none of which are approved for diagnosing HIV. In fact, there is no test for HIV, it's just an illusion. All their testing, what it's saying is all their testing was that there was something in your blood that triggered the parameters that the test is designed for only. Doesn't mean you have HIV or the so-called HIV virus in your blood at all. Kary Mullis, who invented the PCR, what we now use as the viral load test, which was very important in the COVID-19 pandemic, does not believe his invention can detect HIV, nor does he believe HIV causes AIDS. In fact, he wrote the foreword for Christine's book. How is it that the inventor of the test that we used to measure viral load does not approve it for this use? So, to go on with the review, American biochemists developed the PCRT, sorry, this is more research by me on Kary Mullis. And a PCR test typically refers to a quick, accurate diagnostic test for the early signs of an infectious disease. For example, this is one way for testing for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Now, a valid point that several reviewers have brought up is that many people were dying before being given toxic medications, like AZT, and this is definitely true. However, considering that many people during the 70s and 80s admitted to having upwards of hundreds, even thousands of sex partners a year, and of course he's referring to the gay community, recurrent infections with numerous STDs, prophylactic antibiotic use, cocaine and heroin abuse, use of poppers, nitrate inhalants, which we'll talk about, what I've talked already and we'll talk more about, heavy alcohol consumption and lack of sleep. Is it surprising, their immune systems collapsed? All of these factors alone are known to be immune compromising. Now imagine them mixed together and long-term continuous use. Whether or not you agree with the author, you should do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Scientific facts change over time. And we've seen that with lies from people in power and other scientists about many other things in the last forever. Otherwise, the earth would still be flat. Masturbation would still be considered a disease, and AZT would still be considered a life-saving drug. So I've already mentioned, now I go back to my original notes in part 1, as I again write, especially nitrates, which the gay community was using heavily, and put so succinctly in the previous reviewer of Christine Major's book. And I write, there are absolutely no photographs specifically of the HIV virus. They are using photos of other viruses to indicate that it's HIV, and they cannot replicate and or isolate the virus. These are two critical things that you cannot find absolute proof, even though they write it again and again and again. And during this time, I recall clearly that they kept moving the goalposts, they kept changing the design of the test, because they weren't getting enough people with AIDS that they could say was caused by HIV. And I say, follow the fame and the money. So, I'm not going to read too much more. I'm only on page 12 and it's 33 pages. I will list this. The Spin magazine, this article clearly illustrates that even in such a magazine as Spin, which is so anti-HIV AIDS, they still publish articles support people who are dying of something. Then there's this interview with Bob Guccione, who goes into their coverage of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and they started in 1987 with the first articles, and they continued this until they sold the magazine. He sold the magazine in 1996, I believe. Well worth the read. And also the Spin article on the scandal with AZT and how it got approved. So here are my notes on that. This is from the Spin magazine, that this person Sloan Kettering states two major facts: that pneumonia a specific type, and Kaposi sarcoma, a specific skin disease, cancer, the overwhelming majority of AIDS patients die of PCP, for which, now that's the pneumonia, not the drug to get high, for which there has been an effective treatment for decades. The FDA finally approved aerosolized pentamidine for AIDS. She concluded by 15 months, 80% of people on AZT not receiving pentamidine had a recurring episode of pneumonia. Only 5% of those people who did get pentamidine had a recurring episode. All these deaths in the AZT study were treatable. They weren't deaths from AIDS. They were deaths from treatable conditions. They didn't even do any autopsies for that study. What kind of faith can one have in these people? And this is exactly what I've said from beginning of this in part 1 and continually will say through this 4-part series. Where are the autopsies and where is the collection of all these data and what these people really are dying of? So more on pneumonia. Just quickly, despite broad awareness among clinicians that these patients are at increased risk for developing infectious pneumonia, immunocompromised people are often excluded from pneumonia clinical guidelines and treatment trials because it would slowly and suddenly really prove that people are dying of pneumonia and nothing to do with HIV. So this is, again, and I've mentioned this a few times, the best read if you're not a scientist like myself, but understand what logic and facts mean and can understand and decipher the truth. Stefan Nalenka is a microbiologist, a German microbiologist, and he wrote this in April, May of 95. And if you want to really understand what happened between 83 and 95, this is the article. And he clearly breaks down everything that they have claimed about HIV and debunks all of it in very clear, concise, almost non-scientific terms, so very, very easy to understand. So I've said here, now there is only one company that has been approved for the testing of HIV. Why? I believe that the other companies did not want to move the testing criteria so far from what was originally prescribed, and now I think they're up to the 5th iteration of these so-called blood tests. They stopped making the test kit. And secondly, the risk involved if they were suddenly in a major class action lawsuit, if the tests were ever considered not acceptable in proving that you have HIV, or even the virus was, or the antigens were there that you had HIV, but now they're suddenly vanished. Not acceptable, viable, or in fact test for what they have been touted. So again, please read this article. It is the best. There was researchers back in 93 that also totally debunked the whole theory idea that HIV and the story and the virology behind it is that HIV is a virus. And they proved it conclusively. And yet, I actually tried to contact them last year. I did not get a response from the university. And I understand why. Because talking about AIDS and HIV, even today, is a death knell. And they will stop funding you. Everyone will stop funding you. The government or the country you live in, and the pressure that the US government and CDC, NIH, the WHO, they will destroy you. So this is one of the critical statements that he makes, and that is the enzyme responsible became known as reverse transcriptase, and a lot of new myths arose. So what he's saying that Montagnier discovered, was already discovered 13 years earlier in 1970, and that is that, and I don't understand this of course, but basically it has always been thought that DNA was transcribed, converted into messenger RNA, and that the reverse process from RNA to DNA was impossible. But in fact, it was discovered in 1970 that that was true. You can look up we know what DNA is, but you can look up what RNA is. I've looked it up many times and I cannot remember. So he's claiming that that's all they discovered was reverse transcriptase, and they've called it HTLV. And that Gallo also refused to go back to 1970 and see what they actually discovered was exactly what reverse transcriptase is. Another little note, he says, interestingly, the spread of cancer viruses was blamed on homosexuals, prostitutes and black people, just as AIDS came to be 13 years later. So this is under the heading, an error of the past, cancer caused by viruses. Another lie, and so much of the AIDS research has been trying to connect cancer to HIV. So this is the last I will read from him. Whenever and wherever reverse transcriptase activity was detected, it was rashly assumed that retroviruses were at work. This turned out to be a grave error because it was later found that the enzyme occurred in all living matter, proving that reverse transcriptase activity had nothing to do with retroviruses. This is a huge statement, and he backs it up with these research articles, and goes back to 1970, as I've said, and I'll just read this. There's so much in this guy's article. The main players have since 93 begun to slink off, arguing that the virus had mutated so much is now no longer detectable. And yet they, even since this article came out in 95, they have pushed this narrative. And as I showed with Christine Maggiore, and how many thousands and thousands of people have died because of this lie. So, and he also mentions the combination of clinical conditions, which I mentioned earlier. I see the fifth condition that I couldn't think of was if they had a nasty a nasty cough in Africa with the four other conditions, then they were considered to have AIDS. In other words, they were poverty, living in poverty, or diseases of poverty. And as he says, and I will get into later also in the final part of this series, finally the effect of positive test results on mental and physical health needs to be considered and investigated. Okay, he goes on. He has all these headings. He talks about LAV, the first so-called mention of HIV. So what makes a virus new? And these are the rest of the headings. So it's quite a long article. Highly recommend that you read it. If that doesn't convince you, then almost nothing will. And also any articles, the spin articles, and also the the latest article in 2005 from here, CELIA Farber. And if these articles don't convince you, then you are not convincible. So this is part in the first part. I just copy and pasted it. This will be my last part 4 of this series, that I will be comparing CELIA Farber's article and especially the rebuttal by Dr. Gallo, and look at Dr. Gallo's rebuttal and dissect everything he has tried to debunk. So, an article in the New York Times back in 2006, I thought they were much better reporting and reporters, but I read, if you want to read more rubbish from New York Times, you can read this article. I have debunked 4 articles, or highly criticized them in the last couple of months because of the bad research and reporting in the articles. Again, a controversy that he said AIDS researchers had resolved long ago. How does he know? He's just a reporter. He's not someone like CELIA Farber, who's been researching this for 30 years. And of course, the thousands of scientists who never believed it in the first place, this author had zero to support or refute any content that he writes about. And all the criticism that CELIA Farber has been the criticism that she's been given just because she wrote a story. And people can't distinguish, it seems, between describing dissent and being dissent. She has always reported almost non-emotionally on everything that I recall that she has written, especially the first 3-5 articles she wrote about the discovery of HIV. So then I go into non-communicable diseases. As I said, the more I read about this, the more I have to look into almost anything that I come across. This is another good read, and it talks about which diseases actually are communicable. And so you can get a better idea. And these are some of the diseases that what you can and cannot get from somebody else. And then I noticed there were some articles on gene therapy, but I'll go into that as part of the new research and what the scientific community now is trying to convince you that there's more opportunities to help you with HIV. Another article I came across by NIH, and that the evidence that HIV causes AIDS, and yes, this is a long article and it does lay out a positive case, and I include it if you want to read it, but I read too many of these types of articles and do not want to spend any more time refuting such biased and non-critical assessments and conclusions of their studies that support their argument only. So this is one of the latest publications on the epidemic, dated 13th of July, and put out by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they give you all these facts, and there is No proof. And I write, if there are over 40 million people with HIV, how many have been tested to collect this data? How many have died? How many have had autopsies to prove anything like all this data? It's just crap. Now here is a long, this is part of it, on the latest propaganda that is on the web. And I'll just read my comments quickly. What other viruses are dormant for so long? Not many. They talk about how all children with HIV younger than 5 years of age are considered to have advanced HIV disease if your cell count is less than 200 CD4 plus. So as I said, this is the latest. But without treatment, people with HIV infection can also develop severe illnesses. Well, they can also develop all these severe illnesses without being HIV infected. So right in the beginning of this part 2, I also list many other items, or diseases rather, that in fact are not these. So there's 6 other diseases that you can get, and they are so-called opportunistic diseases, which is another way of them saying exactly what they have said right here. So this goes on and on. However, no single test can provide a full HIV positive diagnosis. Confirmatory testing is required, conducted by a qualified and trained health or community worker. I mean, what a lot of crap. You have to be Dr. Duisberg or Dr. Gallo to be able to tell you what cocktail of the latest drugs you should be given. How can you, some doctor in some clinic, tell you which is the best drugs for you anyway? So only for HIV, no other virus, so they discuss in these terms. Why? One test normally suffices for any other virus. So the article goes on and on. Prevention, treatment. Oh, of course, there is no cure for HIV infection. Oh, such lies in this whole propaganda article. So currently art, that is the cocktail of drugs, must be taken every day for the rest of a person's life. And I write, no matter how long, 1 to 6 months, some even a few years, if you are lucky, and then you die. Art lowers the amount of the virus in a person's body. Actually, this is totally a lie. What it does, it gives it slows down the disease, whatever you're dying of. It allows your CD4 plus blood cells, white blood cells, to continue growing because they've been stopped growing because of the immunodeficiency disease you have. And what these art drugs do is it stops the deterioration of these CD4 cells, and then they start to grow again. But what happens after time is that it can't do that any longer, these drugs. So then your CD4 plus count drops again, and then you die. But it goes on and on. So here's the WHO response. More and more absolute lies. This is from the trying to convince us about having anal sex. Anal sex is more risky than vaginal sex. Well, only because they have more data on anal sex because of the high drug use from gay men. So that's how they conclude that anal sex is 18 times more higher, because 18 times more gay men are dying of so-called HIV because their immunity system is shot from taking nitrates. And so they make these statements which is just so pathetic. Where is the proof? Zero back up again. So this is actually not as updated as the previous article, but I guess I threw it in there. Oh, because it has these beautiful photos. The propaganda. What is HIV? There is no cure, but is treatable with medicine. Yep, and then you die. So, I mean, the propaganda here, if left untreated, HIV can lead to the disease AIDS. The human body can't get rid of HIV, and no effective HIV cure exists. So once you have HIV, you have it for life. I mean, the fear-mongering is unbelievable. And it goes on and on. So I'm up to page 26 of 33. I just explained about what happens when you take these ART drugs or combinations and how it affects your CD4 cells. And the propaganda here as suddenly you get all these opportunistic infections. More propaganda, and now I go into an article from sorry, I don't know where it's from. It just says HIV government and other related health issues, and one of them they talk about is opportunistic infections. So propaganda. So opportunistic infections are infections that occur more frequently and are more severe in people with weakened immune systems, including people with HIV. Not just if you have a weakened immune system, but of course they have to include HIV. So now they're trying to, the big lie, many OIs are considered age-defining conditions. That means if a person with HIV has one of these conditions, they are diagnosed with AIDS, the most serious stage of HIV infection. So, but it doesn't mean you have HIV. Okay, this is the same as the previous articles, but now they've got a new terminology or another description, opportunistic infections. So these are the ones in the beginning of this part 2, and so it's not enough for this article. So it says visit CDC for a detailed list. What causes opportunistic infections? Well, guess what? Your immunity system is shot. That's it. And it goes on about CD4 and, of course, HIV.gov, more propaganda. So here is some of the ways people with HIV can reduce their risk of getting an OI, which are all things that you do day to day from people leading a normal life. What, am I going to eat the cat litter? So, try not to get too emotional of the rubbish and lies and propaganda. So if you get an OI, God forbid it's just pneumonia or it is just herpes, or salmonella infection, or thrush, or TB, God forbid you just get that from normal life, as we have been getting for the last few thousand years. So they're saying if you get any of these infections and you look at the complete list from CDC, then you must have AIDS. So this is a reasonably good article on what to know about viruses. I believe I really liked it because it doesn't mention HIV or AIDS. So you can get a really good description in here of what viruses are. And this is another little bit of propaganda that comes from research that they are trying to put out there, that they, as the heading states, researchers at MIT's Lincoln Lab have developed technology that may someday cure the common cold, influenza, and other ailments. Now, the critical word here is may. So they've developed a drug and they claim could cure nearly any viral infection. So I read the article and it looks really beautiful. They got great slides. It was published in July on 27 in some journal, PLS01. What's the date? This is 2011. And I looked at this because it's 2011, because guess what? First of all, there's no mention of HIV. And of course, where is this drug today? What has happened to it? I tried to find any follow-up to this and I couldn't find anything. So in other words, it was a complete waste of time. This is like finding HIV in that random one person, two person, whatever it was, people back in 1983, and they developed a whole theory. Well, I guess people are not going to stick their necks out anymore like Montagnier and Gallo did, and start giving out lies and theories which cannot be backed up, reproduced, or get even a photo of to continue their research. In other words, it all disappeared. I only show this article to indicate, even though research is obviously going on, HIV may not be the primary reason for the research, but all the other known and treatable viruses. So maybe this research is to try and find a cure for HIV, I don't know. But maybe they will find cures for some of the other viruses, and I hope they do. Because our immunity system is very, very susceptible, as COVID-19 has shown. And I hope that you keep healthy, and see you in the next part 3 on the drugs they have passed on to us to try and kill us faster in most cases. Thanks. See you soon.